Hello, I'm Garth Forster, pastor of First Baptist Church here in Barnesville today, along with Greg Burrell, our minister of music for the last 36 years here in Barnesville. Greg was here when they built our sanctuary back in 1883. So he's been here a long time, seen a lot of folks come and go, but he's been steady. He has done a wonderful job with us at worship. I've always complimented him from the perspective that when he first got here back in 1984,
It's true.
he was leading Latin oratorios.
Oh, yeah.
And today he's doing rock and
Sure.
roll with an electric guitar, and he's done a great job reproducing himself, remaking himself with the times. And, that's what you have to do. The message of the gospel never changes. The mission of the church never changes. But the methods that we use as the church have to change to reach each succeeding generation. And Greg has been able to do that, and I appreciate it so very much. Greg, thank you, brother. We appreciate
Well,
you.
of course. Thank you, Pastor. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Thank you kindly, my friend. Looking at the sermon from yesterday, dealt with a sermon called Hope, the Anchor of the Soul. The book of Hebrews talks about hope being our anchor of our souls. And that's a fascinating image, because really what it means is that without hope, our life is basically in the situation where we are adrift on a sea of hopelessness without that anchor of hope. We are on a sea adrift with hopelessness. And I think that's a beautiful image and a very picturesque image that we have of our lives with regard to hope. And of course, I chose 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as the great New Testament chapter on hope, because it's the great chapter on the resurrection. We started with the idea that hope is the anchor of our souls, but the idea is hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the anchor of our souls. Not just any hope, because there are plenty of hopes that never get fulfilled, but rather the hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because it's already been fulfilled.
And a looking forward to the day that Jesus comes back. That's a hope that we share, and it's a different. We think of hope as I hope this happens. I hope this happens. But Christian hope is, man, I'm looking forward to the day when Jesus comes back.
There's a certainty to it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
There's a certainty to it.
Yes.
And that's what we talked about yesterday, the certainty of Christ's resurrection. And there's evidence for that resurrection in the Gospels themselves. As a matter of fact, the Gospels show to us, as well as the rest of the books of the New Testament, why our hope is valid. Our hope is valid because the evidence proves that Christ really rose from the dead. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel, the good news that I preached to you, which you've received and on which you've taken your stand, on which you built your life." He said, "By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you, otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." Now, when he says first importance, that means this is going to be special. He says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. That is the gospel in a nutshell, if we will. And most of the theologians tell us that was probably the earliest creed of the Christian church. Those verses right there, verses 3 and 4, the earliest creed of the Christian church from the perspective of what the gospel was really all about. And then, of course, Paul goes on to talk about the eyewitnesses to the resurrection. Verse 5, he says, "And that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one born out of due time." Think about those witnesses with me, Greg, for a moment.
Man, those are the best. That's a roll call right there.
Absolutely. Starting with Peter. Peter perhaps is the one witness who gathered around other witnesses his life transformation. There's no way of explaining that. How he could have turned to that cowardly, or from that cowardly denier of Christ on that Good Friday or Maundy Thursday evening, just before the crucifixion of Jesus on Good Friday. How he turned from that cowardly denier of Christ then to this crusading proclaimer of Christ just a few weeks later. I mean, what can change a man like that?
Only the work of the Holy Spirit in his life.
Absolutely. Only Christ can change. Only the resurrection could change a man like
There
that.
you go. And you see that same kind of dramatic change in Paul of Tarsus.
That's
you
right.
know, wow! Just to go from someone who persecuted the church and to the end of his life called himself the worst of sinners because of that. Did a 180-degree turn and became the greatest missionary Christianity has ever had.
Absolutely. Said he was one that was born out of due time.
Yep.
Came to Christ later on. He talks about he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at one time. Now that's 500 sets of eyeballs eyewitnessing the resurrection of Christ. And in any court of law, that would be very admissible evidence.
You better believe it.
And he talks about James. James, some people confuse, there's several James in the New Testament. And this James is the half-brother of Jesus who did not believe in him during his lifetime. But somehow through the resurrection, an unbelieving brother became not only a believing brother, but also one of the leaders of the early church in Jerusalem. Writes the letter of James that we have at the end of our New Testaments. And so this radical transformation is what we really we stand on from the perspective of why do we believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Because all the evidence that we have points that direction.
And those three men that we're talking about all gave their lives for what they believed.
Absolutely.
They all died because they were so sure that Jesus was who he said he was.
Yeah. Brings up a point that Lee Strobel makes in one of his books when he says, men won't die for a lie, neither will women. Men won't die for a lie, but they will die for the truth.
Yes.
And at some point in time, if they knew this was a lie, if they knew this was a Passover plot that they had put together, at some point in their lives when they faced the sword or faced crucifixion, they would have confessed that they'd been lying all along.
Sure.
But none of them did that. All of them went to their graves. All of them went to a tormenting death, believing that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead and proclaiming that very truth. Paul talks after this about the emptiness of our faith if Christ did not rise from the dead. But then in verse 20 he says, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of all those that have fallen asleep. And that's a beautiful passage because to the Jewish people for 1,200 years they had celebrated the Feast of First Fruits right about the time of the Passover. And when Passover Sabbath had taken place, the next day, the day after that, was when the Feast of First Fruits was going to take place, and the priest would go into the temple, and before the great veil, before the Holy of Holies, he would wave that sheaf of barley before the Lord. And this was God's promise that the rest of the harvest would be as good as that first sheaf of barley was good. And at the very moment the priest was doing that, this is just one of those neat biblical concepts. At the very, very moment that the priest was doing that, Jesus Christ was rising from the dead.
Mm.
And the first fruits, Paul tells us that he is. He calls Jesus the first fruits of all those that have fallen asleep. Of all those that have died, he is the first fruits. The idea that as he has risen from the dead, so will we rise from the dead. A powerful lesson for us in terms of what Paul says here in this passage. We looked at the end of the passage, end of chapter 15, from verses 50 to 58. And of course, it talks about several things. First of all, our transformation at the coming of Christ. And we've all heard the word the rapture, that Christ will return for his church. People may disagree about exactly how that's going to happen or exactly when that's going to happen. I've always said that when it comes to the second coming of Christ, there are only two things we can know for sure. They're both biblical. He that shall come will come, and that his coming is now nearer than it was when we first believed. We can say those things without any hesitation at all. In terms of all the plots and plans and charts, I don't know about all those, but I do know that he that shall come will come. That's right.
You know?
That's right. He that shall come will come. But when we look at this passage, of course, he's saying that the bodies of those who knew Christ and loved Christ and died, they'll be resurrected. Now, I always thought that the resurrection referred only to the soul. But that was an ancient belief. Even the Greeks believed that.
Mm-hmm.
What was different about Christianity is the body is going to be resurrected and reunited with the soul. And so when it speaks of the resurrection, it means to stand up again from among the dead. It's the concept that our bodies will be somehow risen, gloriously remolded, reshaped, remade, transformed, then reunited with our spirits, and so shall we ever be with the Lord, Paul says. A tremendous truth for us. So there's our transformation at the coming of Christ. Then there's our triumph in the cross of Christ, that the sting of death has lost its ability to hurt us or to harm us because Jesus took that sting for us. Just a tremendous truth that we see here that Paul talks about. Lastly, of course, there's that 58th verse, the very last verse of the chapter. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is never, ever in vain. Whatever you do for Christ.
Grow not weary in well-doing, as
That's
Paul
right.
says. Yeah.
That's right. Right out of Galatians. Grow not weary in well-doing, for in due season you shall reap an abundant harvest if you don't lose heart and quit. Always labor for the Lord. Sometimes we get discouraged, don't we? Sometimes we feel like our lives really aren't making any difference. Sometimes we feel like our efforts don't really make a lot of difference. But I'll tell you something, dear friend, no matter who they do or don't make a difference with in this world, they make a great difference to God, because you have been faithful, because you've continued to do what God wanted you to do. And because of that, your efforts will one day be rewarded. Don't lose heart. Make sure you continue to love the Lord and serve the Lord. Greg, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
God bless you, brother. Thank you. Thank you for joining us as well as we gather together